Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at alternate Christian movements in the history of Christianity. The Shakers were a splinter group from the Quakers. They called themselves the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. By that title, you can see where their emphasis was located. And so they were also known as the Shaking Quakers. They taught that the end of the world is near, and they believed that the second coming would be through a woman. That took on a very particular face with the coming of Mother Ann Lee, who joined the group in 1758. She claimed to have revelations and that sexual relations were the root of all evil. It did gain a following. Tongues were part of the movement. And she taught that God was both male and female, and that she was the second coming of Christ. Now, you would think that this movement would completely dissipate with her death, but instead, once she died, new leaders rose up after her death. In 1784, Joseph Meacham and Lucy Wright both led the group as a not man and wife, but as a male and female couple. They taught in gender equality that the kingdom was both male and female and would be led by men and women, and they exemplified that. They engaged in communal living with the group, and they were pacifists like their Quaker forerunners. Indeed, they were exempted from military service by Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War. Another group that rose up were the Rapites. These were followers of George Rapp. He was a Lutheran separatist and claimed to be a prophet. Seems to be a little bit of a common theme here. He led a group of followers from Germany, where the Lutherans had begun, to the Americas. He was premillennial. Amillennialism had been sort of the order of the day, both among Roman Catholics, among Eastern Orthodox, and now among both Luther and Calvinists and other Reformed folk. Premillennialism looked at Revelation chapter 20 in a very literal sense. They felt that Jesus was going to return and establish an earthly millennium of 1,000 years. Remember that passage talks about how Christ comes and rules and reigns for 1,000 years. They felt that that was going to literally take place in the future at the coming of Jesus. He taught that Napoleon was the Antichrist. Um, uh, One of the things we're going to see is a number of different Antichrist figures. Whoever's the most unpopular political leader of the day will arise to that title. And he, like Mother Ann Lee, he taught celibacy and communal living. Um, he finally says that Christ is going to come in 1825. Now, the group isn't going to last much beyond that when Christ doesn't show up. Let me just say Christ did not come in 1825, but we're going to see a common theme among many of these groups. Now, here's our timeline. Remember, the Second Great Awakening had begun just before the 1800s, and it will go at least until 1825, 1830. Some would put it as late as 1835, 40, or even 50. It's not going to end with where suddenly one day, oh, the Great Awakening is over. It's going to sort of gradually dissipate. And of course, the American Civil War, because we're going to look a lot in the Americas now, is going to be from 1860 to 1865. Now, John Nelson Darby and the both Mother Ann as well as the Rapites are going to be sort of fringe groups. Darby is going to be part of a group called the Plymouth Brethren, but they're going to be very popular and going to impact Christianity even to today. Now, Darby is going to be the one who brings forth a way of teaching, a way of interpreting the Bible known as dispensationalism. He's not claiming to have any special revelation, although when some of the um, points of theology first come out, they are evidently brought out, where somebody says, I've had a revelation. But Darby says, no, this is just a matter of reading and interpreting the scripture. And dispensationalism is a system of theology, still popular today among many people, that teaches that God has two separate plans and peoples. There is God's plan for Israel, beginning with his promises to Abraham and then the establishment of the nation of Israel under Moses. But then when you get to Jesus, after the coming of Jesus, something new was established, a new plan, a new purpose, and that was the church. And that God keeps these two plans and people separate. He never mixes them up. So there's promises to Israel and promises to the church, and never the twain shall meet. He also taught that there were two kinds of Christians, that there were spiritual Christians and that there were fleshly Christians. If you had asked anyone from mainline Christianity, for example, the Roman Catholics, or even the Reformed folk, or like Calvin or Luther, or folks like the Puritans, they would have said, "Well, there's just a Christian. A Christian is one who's spiritual. If you look at somebody who's fleshly, there's no spiritual life there. That's what we call an unbeliever. That's what we call a non-Christian." And Darby says, "No, no, it's possible to become a Christian, but there be no outward signs of that." He also taught, and this is a very distinctive thing, that Christ would have two future comings. Yes, that Jesus had come, back uh, in at the beginning of, prior to the beginning of the church, but that he would not only come again, but that he would come again twice. Now, it's laid out this way. This is dispensationalism. Of course, you begin with creation, and throughout those early years, God entered into a number of dispensations. That is, God entered into, there are different time periods, uh, both with Adam and with Noah and with the Tower of Babel, and each one ends in failure. But then God made promises to Abraham and then fulfilled those promises, at least in part, through Moses by the establishing of a nation. So you have that Old Testament era where God was dealing, once Israel came about, God was dealing with Israel and giving promises to Israel that would eventually be fulfilled. But then when Jesus came, still in the Old Testament era, he promised that something new would come. And so after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, you have the coming of the Holy Spirit, and that begins something new, and that new thing is the church. And at the coming of the church, um, it was as it were, as though God had punched the stopwatch, where he was no longer going to deal with Israel, he was now going to deal with the church, and Israel was put on hold. A great parenthesis is seen in the church, where the church is a parenthesis, a parenthetical pause between God dealing with Israel and then God dealing with the church, which continues up to this day. Dispensationalists would say we're still in that New Testament era, they were still in that church age, but there's coming a day when Jesus will return, sort of, in what they term the rapture. Now you say, well, what's the rapture? I thought Jesus was going to return. Well, they're going to talk about the second coming of Jesus, but before the second coming of Jesus, Jesus comes partway in the rapture of the church, and at such a time, God, uh, he he raptures the church. He gathers all Christians who are alive, and takes them up to heaven, and remember that stopwatch? It's as though God restarts the stopwatch, and now that the church has been removed from earth, that the church has been taken up to heaven, that God is now dealing again with Israel, and will do so for a period of 7 years, a 7 year, and it's going to be a time of tribulation. Horrendous times. If you look at the book of Revelation, they say that everything that takes place after Revelation chapter, at the end of chapter 5, that suddenly that's, starting in Revelation chapter 6 with the breaking of those seven seals and the seven trumpets and the seven vials, all those bad things that take place, that's all part of that tribulation, where God is dealing with Israel. Meanwhile, the church is in heaven, and the church has been removed from all of that. At the end of those 7 years, now Christ's second coming takes place. So notice, Christ came part way and he gathered all the people. took them back to heaven. He comes back in the second coming. He again gathers people because all those people that are any people that are still alive and faithful to him, he gathers them together with his angels. But now he comes all the way back to the earth, and in the rapture he only came part way back. He gathered them in the clouds, but then took them back to heaven. And so in the second coming, he returns all the way to the earth, and now he begins his 1,000-year reign of Christ. Of course, that's that earthly millennium. Um, and so that dispensationalism, let me just say, dispensationalism is always premillennial. That is, Christ comes back, and then after that, he begins this 1,000-year reign of Christ. And after that 1,000-year reign, that you have a great white throne judgment, and then you enter into eternity. So now there are all sorts of folks that are premillennial that don't necessarily hold to these other aspects of dispensationalism, of a rapture and then a second coming. That's very specific to dispensationalism. Something that's going to give a lot of impetus to the teaching of dispensationalism will be the Scofield Reference Bible, published in 1909. You can still find copies of it today. It's still being published, uh, done by Cyrus Scofield, who he was a lawyer who had become a Christian and then become a dispensationalist. And he publishes this Bible with dispensational doctrinal notes placed, integrated into the text. Notice you see the text of the Bible on this page. You see cross references, but also you have study notes, and as you look, the study notes are about the same print, and they're below. But um, a lot of folk looked at this Bible, and they really didn't get the point that you had the Bible sections separate, and they just looked at, it's all in the Bible, and so they thought the study notes, well, that was just part of the Bible. And so there would be a bit of confusion there. I've actually met people that I had to explain that no, the study notes that was added by certain people. It teaches their doctrinal thoughts, what they believed that the Bible meant, but it wasn't actually part of the original text. Now, the Oneida community, a different group now, founded by John Noyes, he had been converted under Finney. Remember that Finney was one of the great preachers of the Second Great Awakening. He attended Yale Divinity School, and he took the position of preterism, a full preterist. Now, preterism is the teaching that Jesus has already come back, that the fall of Jerusalem back in 70 AD was the return of Jesus. Whether physically or spiritually, but that was the coming of Jesus, and there is no other second coming, no rapture, no second coming, nothing more. We're just here, and this is all there is. Of course, when you die, then you'll see Jesus. But he took the position of preterism. It was a relatively new position. It's a position that really, in recent years, has gained some following. Just in the last in the last 23 years or so, I've seen a number of preterists sort of come out of the woodwork. He also taught that you can be perfect. He says, I took away their license to sin, and they go on sinning. They have taken away my license to preach, because his views were not seen as biblical or even within the realm of orthodoxy. So he was actually defrocked from his ability to preach. He says, they have taken away my license to preach, but I shall go on preaching. He established a community of followers in Oneida in the state of New York, 1841, and this was designed to experience millennial living now. And remember, there's no second coming of Jesus. There's no future millennium, so we're going to experience the millennium right now. This was a communal living, and they taught that there was a difference between spiritual versus physical sexuality. And so they engaged actually in controlled breeding, where someone would be given authorization to go and um, engage in sexual relations and then have children, and that would be decided by the group. It's not something where you decide I'm going to get married. No, no, this would actually be organized through the group. He authorities finally came in to close them down, and he escaped to Canada. Now, we've mentioned Darby. The Mormons coming right about the same time. Now, I don't want to, just because they're coming about the same time doesn't mean that there's any affinity to them. Darby would have been classified as a Christian and some distinctive beliefs within that, but he was Orthodox in the sense that he believed in uh, the the major, for example, the Apostles' Creed. He would have agreed with that. Joseph Smith is going to be a very different matter. Uh, Joseph Smith, the founder, came out of the burned over district of New York. By burned over, that doesn't mean that they had physical fires, but that they had had so many different religious groups, revivals, and we talked about earlier, and some of the Oneida group, different groups that had risen out of that. It was like, oh, is this just going to be another religious movement? They had seen their share of them. And he and his father were treasure hunters. They were always going out and looking for buried treasure. And one day he claimed to have found some. That he found these, he called them seer stones. When he described them, they were like big, gigantic, magical spectacles. And if you look through these spectacles, these eyeglasses, that you would see special things. And he says that the angel Moroni had appeared to him, and had shown him these, and had shown him some golden tablets which were written in Reformed Egyptian. Now there is no such thing as Reformed Egyptian. There's ancient Egyptian and there's Demotic, but that's not Reformed. Um, and that when he used the glasses to look at these golden tablets, it would magically translate. And so these glasses were the Urim and the Thummim. Now remember, there's a reference to the Urim and Thummim that would be used by the high priest and kept within his chest piece. It doesn't describe what those are. The word Urim, just is the word for light, and so the im is plural. So the Urim is the lights, and then Tam is the Hebrew word for perfection. Again, that's plural with the Tumim. So the lights and the perfections is what the Old Testament describes, and he says, well, that was describing these big giant magic glasses, 3 feet across, and of course nobody ever saw the glasses. Nobody ever saw the tablets, but the tablets themselves, he translated them with the help of the glasses, and this became the Book of Mormon, a highly imaginative book published in 1830, and it tells the story of a family of Jewish people who leave Jerusalem in the year 600 BC, just before Nebuchadnezzar captures the city, and they travel by ship all the way to the Americas. Now, long before Columbus, they travel across the Atlantic Ocean, and they come to the Americas, and they give rise to two people groups, the Nephites and the Lamanites. And as time passes, a lot of begetting, and these two people groups fight a great war between one another. And that Jesus, when he comes, many 600 years later, that Jesus, after coming to Israel and dying upon the cross, that he rose again, and then he came to America, and he preached first to Israel, but then later on preached to the United States of America. And there was a final destruction of the Nephites, who had previously been at odds with the sort of the godly remnant, and they were destroyed. And that Jesus had said back in John chapter 10, verse 16, remember he says there, I have other sheep which are not of this fold, and that he was speaking of the people in the Americas, that they were the other sheep. And so that when he was leaving, he was going to go to these other peoples. Now, most people look at John chapter 10, verse 16, saying other sheep. that's probably not just the Jewish people, but the Gentiles, which is fulfilled in Acts chapter in the book of Acts as the gospel not only goes to the Jewish people, but it goes also to the Gentiles. But no, um, Smith said, no, that other sheep, those are the people in the Americas. His followers eventually moved to Kirtland, Ohio, where they lived for a time. But then, when persecutions began to arise over some of their teachings, they moved first to Missouri, and he taught that the Garden of Eden had been in Missouri, that's where it had originally been located, and somehow the rest of humanity had gone back to the Middle East and grown up there. He also taught that polygamy is for today. That in the same way that Abraham and Isaac, well, Isaac hadn't, but Jacob had two wives, and many of the people in the Old Testament era had multiple wives, and we're returning to that. And so he took for himself a number of wives. Probably started when he decided he wanted another wife to add on. Um, and so this was for today, and that wasn't very popular among the non-Mormons, these people that are trying to take a number of wives, and so as a result, they're forced to move again, and they move to Illinois. And there's actually, while they're in Illinois, in the late 1830s, 1838, what's called the Mormon War, where they take up arms, both the Mormons against people that disagree with them, and Smith himself is both arrested and hung. He is lynched in 1844. And so he dies. You think, well, that's going to be the end of the movement, but instead they're going to have a new leader that rises up. This new leader will be Brigham Young, and he will lead them from that era out west beyond the borders of the United States to an area known as Utah. You say, well, I thought Utah was a state. Well, it wasn't a state yet, and it was not even a possession of the United States. It was a possession of Spain. And so it was on the northern part of Spain. Remember, Spain took in what we call Texas today, and the entire Midwest and West. That was all part of Spain. And so they found a city by a Great Salt Lake. Um, Now remember that Jerusalem was founded rather close, within about 18, 20 miles of a Great Salt Lake, what we call the Dead Sea. And so this was seen as a New Jerusalem, Salt Lake City. And at the time, as I said, it was part of Mexico. But then later on, when the United States and Mexico had a war, that was what we call the Mexican War, um, the United States they took as their possession not Mexico, but those northern territories of Mexico, including Utah. So Utah now became uh, a portion of, it was not a state yet, but a portion of the United States, a possession, we would say. And then when the California Gold Rush came about in the late 1840s, that suddenly saw a lot of Americans moving westward through Utah. And so that California eventually is going to become a state. And those other possessions, some of them will become states as well. Statehood is initially designed to Utah, the area of Utah, because of this polygamy issue. And so, and Brigham Young will long have since died by this time. They will be under a new leadership, but they will have a new quote unquote revelation that will say, okay, polygamy is out. It's been revealed to us, no more polygamy. And then once the Mormon Church denies polygamy, renounces polygamy, then they will become a state after that. And so 1896, they do become part of the United States and remain such today. That's one of the states, and yet it's a state that is largely um, populated by Mormons. That's not only the center of that religion. Um, it still continues to hold great influence, although you can find Mormons in other places today. Now, the Mormon theology, and they like to describe themselves as the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. That's their official title. Although they'll take the term Mormon. Um, they like to describe themselves as Christians, and that Jesus is part of their teaching, but they teach some things that are very distinctive from Christians. They teach that all existence is material and that God has a physical body. Ask any other Christian, and you're not going to get that. And Christians teach that God is spirit. Um, but they teach that no, God has a physical body. Think about the times in the Old Testament where it says the hand of the Lord or the arm of the Lord is strong. Most Christians take that as figurative language, but they say no, God has an actual physical body, and that God has another God over him, and that God has a God over that God. So there's sort of a progression. But the God that we deal with is the God of this world. If you go to other worlds, that you might find other gods over those worlds. But God started out very much like us with I have a physical body, but that God transcended that. He grew, and the same way that God used to be like us, that we can one day be like God, that we will maybe have our own worlds in which we will be God over those worlds, and that Jesus and Satan are spirit brothers. They remember they originally taught in polygamy. They had a quote unquote new revelation that said, okay, polygamy is out, monogamy is in. But there are those who say, well, Joseph Smith taught that polygamy was for today, so we're going to continue. So those are outliers. Those are sort of they've separated from the general Mormon Church to have their own branches. They're not all that popular today, but there's some that still hold to that. And of course, since polygamy is illegal in all of the states of the United States, what they will normally do is they'll have one legal wife, and then the others will be taken um, not through the civil courts, but through religious ceremonies. They will also, not just the outliers, but the Mormon Church today practices proxy baptisms. That is, if you can go be baptized in place of someone who has already died. Um, they take this from a verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 29, where Paul is making an argument about how the resurrection is true. And he said, if resurrection wasn't true, then why are they baptized for the dead? Now, Paul doesn't explain what he means by that. In the context, he's speaking of those who are being persecuted and even dying for their faith. And so most Christians look at that and say, well, there's new Christians that are being baptized in place of the ones that have died. But the Mormon Church says, no, we're being baptized for those that have died because there's going to be a resurrection, and so therefore they can't be baptized for themselves. They've already died, so we're being baptized for them, and that will benefit them. Um, and because of that, the Mormons, they take very careful genealogical records, ancestry.com and things like that, or I'm not sure if they're actually designed by the Mormons, but certainly a tool that is used by them, and they will research different people's genealogy so that they can have these baptisms for those who have already died. Now, we talked about Darby, the Mormons, one more group right around the same time, followers of William Miller, known as the Millerites, and he's engaging in Bible study, and he looks at passages in Daniel that give prophecies about years and weeks and things like that, and he says, I have figured out when Jesus is going to come. And so he states this very specific date I think it was in the 1840s, that Jesus is going to come. And his followers sell all of their belongings and they're waiting for Jesus to come. And it's sad to say, Jesus doesn't show up. And so you have in 1848 the Great Disappointment. But that doesn't stop them. They say, well, maybe we missed it by a day. We didn't take certain things into account. Remember how when you go from 1 BC to 180, there's no year zero. Miller says, well, I forgot that. And so again, there's, waiting for, and again, Jesus doesn't come. And so finally they decided, well, Jesus did come, but he came spiritually. And his followers, at least some of them, will go on to bring about the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so that will be one of the outgrowths. And the Seventh Day Adventists, of course, the title tells you something about what is important to them. That we should be worshiping not on the first day of the week, as most of the church has been doing ever since Acts chapter 2. The Holy Spirit showed up on the first day of the week. But no, we should be worshiping on the seventh day of the week, and that becomes a very big issue to them. Now, I know some Christians that, for example, my old college roommate is a Messianic rabbi, and they have their worship services on Saturday rather than on Sunday, and but they don't say if you're not doing that you can't be saved. The Seventh Day Adventists take a very very strong view that God sees that as the great blasphemy. Now, in more recent times, they've gone through a few changes, but they still practice worship on the seventh day of the week, but it's no longer a salvation issue among them. Another group that we're going to see is followers of Charles Taze Russell, who begins as a follower of Miller. Um, the same idea that he feels like they figured out when Jesus is going to come, and then he doesn't. But his followers he will actually organize something called the Watchtower Tract Society, a society, a publication society that is producing literature of some of his teachings. And his followers will be popularly known today as the Jehovah's Witnesses. And if you ask the Jehovah's Witnesses, when did Jesus come back? Not when is he coming back, but when did he return? They'll tell you, well, in 1914, Jesus returned spiritually. And that movement still goes on even today. Now I want to turn to Roman Catholicism in America. Now I've been looking at alternate things, and Roman Catholicism has been around. Well, Catholicism, the term actually just means the everybody church. So when you speak of Roman Catholicism, that's not quite everybody. It's everyone who has their base in Rome with the Roman Catholic Vatican and the Pope. They were a tiny minority in the Americas at the American Revolution, but they would now grow, and so you begin to see the growth of Roman Catholic population, especially with folks. I think of the Irish, for example, as they are migrating, and other groups migrating to the Americas. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Remember where the French had colonized that area to some degree. It was their quote unquote possession, and they sell it to Napoleon Bonaparte sells it to Thomas Jefferson, not privately, but to the United States in 1803. And the French had been overwhelmingly Roman Catholic. And so that had brought a certain number of Roman Catholics into the new nation. As I mentioned, Irish immigrants already, but there were also German Catholic immigrants, especially from southern Germany, the area known as Bavaria. That was largely Roman Catholic, whereas northern Germany was largely Lutheran. And then the Mexican American War, which resulted in, we already noted Utah, but other folks from Mexico that now become part of the United States, places like Texas and Oklahoma and areas like this. Well, they were largely Roman Catholic. So as they now come under the United States, this is Roman Catholics becoming part of the United States, and Catholicism is growing. Now, 1844, the Roman Catholic Church is burned, or a Roman Catholic Church is burned in the in Bible riots in Saint Augustine, um, and that's just one element of persecution. Of the Protestants actually persecuting Roman Catholics who were a minority in this country. You also have a Philadelphia riot in the mid 1800s over the reading of the Douay-Rheims version in a school. The Douay-Rheims version is a Roman Catholic translation. It was it had been translated by the Roman Catholics. Now, at an earlier date, the Roman Catholics had said, "Well, no, we want to read the Latin version." You say, "I can't read Latin," that you couldn't really read the Bible. But this version had been authorized by Rome, and it was an English translation, um, rather favorable in some of its wording to Roman Catholic theology. And so a riot develops and over the fact that some people are using this to read in the public school. Remember, in the 1800s, you did have Bible reading in the public school. You begin to have anti-Catholic propaganda. Fox's Book of Martyrs, which had come out um, back in England at a much earlier age, and yet Fox's Book of Martyrs, a greater portion of it was Fox's Book of Martyrs at the hands of Roman Catholics, um, with Bloody Mary, and remember that whole where the English Church had gone from Henry VIII to Edward VI, but then to Bloody Mary. Edward VI had been um, reformed in his outlook, although not for very long because he still died as a teenager. But then Bloody Mary had been for a number of years and had persecuted the church, and then there was a release from that with her death and the coming of Queen Elizabeth. And since that time, the Roman Catholics had been on the outs in England. So Fox's Book of Martyrs um, just details, and it was telling the truth, but it was written. It talks really about the persecutions of the Roman Catholics, how Roman Catholic Mary persecuted Protestants. It did not go on to talk about how there were times when Elizabeth persecuted Catholics. So we don't talk about Bloody Elizabeth. We talk about Bloody Mary. And then the book Maria Monk that was published in 1836. Notice the title, Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk. She was supposed to have been a nun, or the hidden secrets of a nun's life in a convent, and then exposed, illustrated with upward of 40 engravings. And you see one of these engravings where she's being made a nun. And then as the story unfolds, and it's very fanciful, let me just say that. Um, I believe my mother had read this book because it continued to be in print for many years later on. And she read this book, and it told all these stories about how that there were tunnels between the the monastic order for the nuns and the priests, and they would go in and they would rape the nuns, and it was very sensual, and about how nuns would get pregnant all the time and would be forced to engage in sexual activity with the priests. Now, none of this was based in reality. I'm not saying nothing ever happened between nuns and priests, but none of this was based in reality. It was pure fancy, and it made for exciting reading and just a little titillating, actually. The Know Nothing Party in the early 1800s was a very specific anti-Roman Catholic political party. They were anti-immigration, anti-Roman Catholic immigration as part of that. And so they were anti-Catholic. The founder of this party was Andrew Jackson in the early 1800s. And so you also have the growth of Roman Catholic parochial schools as instead of sending their children to the public school where they would receive a Protestant education and Protestant Bible classes, the Roman Catholics responded by starting their own parochial schools, and um, they called for a separation of the public school. They said you shouldn't be teaching religion in school. Now, what they meant was you shouldn't be teaching Protestant religion in school. So, actually, the call for a separation in the public schools against religious teaching came not from atheists, but from the Roman Catholics who didn't want to see Protestant teachings taught in the public school. Now, some of the teachings from the Roman Catholic Church, of course, a lot of those go back all the way to the Council of Trent and earlier, but the teaching of the Immaculate Conception. And this was came out in a statement published in 1854 by Pope Pius IX, the Affabilis Deus, the ineffable God was the title of it. And what it taught was that Mary was born, not that Mary gave birth to one who was without sin, but that Mary herself was born without sin. And so, therefore, she was sinless and could therefore give birth to one who was himself sinless, that is Jesus. Many people don't understand. They hear Immaculate Conception and they think that's the virgin birth. But no, this is saying that Jesus, not that Jesus, that Mary herself was born without sin. Now, in 1870, you have the First Vatican Council. Going to have a Vatican II, about in the 1900s, but that's going to come quite a bit later. And this was a response to various Enlightenment beliefs that were becoming popular, and so the church now takes a stand against those. And one of the decisions of the First Vatican Council is that the Pope is infallible when he speaks ex cathedra. Now, when you say, what's ex cathedra? That's just Latin, means from the seat. In other words, when he speaks with authority from the seat in Rome. Now, the Pope might say, I think it's going to rain today, and it doesn't rain. That's not from the seat. He's not speaking as a official of the church. He's not making an official pronouncement. But that when he does, that he is infallible. And so, remember, the Pope had said earlier that Mary is, that Mary was born without sin, and that was accepted. So that becomes part of the reasoning that, when the Pope speaks, the church has to listen, and he is speaking, infallibly. The one time this is utilized is in 1950 with the Roman Catholic claim, ex cathedra, that Mary went bodily into heaven. She didn't die, but instead she was taken up into heaven, and she went bodily into heaven. And that's part of Roman Catholic teaching today. Now, the Bible doesn't know anything of that. Doesn't know anything of Mary being born without sin. These are all teachings of the Roman Church that there's no attempt to try to link those to a biblical text, but rather these are things that have come down from the Pope and now are part of Roman Catholic teaching. So our Roman Catholic friends then would say our authority comes partially from the Bible and partially from church councils, but also, the third leg of that stool is from the Pope. And that is the source of our theology.